I'm George Galloway and I present Kalima Horra on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing the conflict between the US and Iran and asking the question, does it showcase the demise of the United States as the world's superpower? Well, up to a point. Chairman Mao said in the 1960s that the United States was a paper tiger. That was a very considerable exaggeration and distinctly premature. A paper tiger, it definitely was not from the 1960s onwards. But it's now, I think, clear to most thinking people in the world that while still a tiger, many of its teeth have fallen out. It has lost much of its power, and it certainly is no longer the undisputed king of the jungle. Iran is a very considerable power, both hard power and soft power, but it isn't in the same league as the United States, which holds most of the nuclear weapons in the world, has a defense budget which is bigger than the next 10 countries combined. It spends, Donald Trump boasts about this on Twitter, literally trillions of dollars on the weapons and machinery of war. So it's an uneven fight, but as is often said in the English language, it's not the size of the dog in the fight that counts, it's the size of the fight in the dog. And Iran seems determined not to be subjugated, not to be overrun, and its government not to be overturned by the United States. The question then is, how much fight is there in the American dog in trying to bring these things about? And my answer is that the United States lacks the resolve, the will, and the ability to triumph over Iran. When Donald Trump came into the press conference 24 hours after Iran had retaliated for the cold-blooded, illegal terrorist murder of General Qasem Soleimani, he said that Iran had stood down, and by implication, therefore, that he would not be taking any further action. He also said that there were no American casualties from Iran's retaliation. Both of those statements were demonstrably false, and it is now officially gazetted by the United States of America that scores of American service personnel were injured in the Iranian missile response. There's some reason to believe, and I don't generally follow conspiracy theories, that there may even have been fatalities that were then distributed to other parts of the world, and their demise was attributed to the place they had been moved to. Whether or not that's true, it is official that at least 40 US personnel suffered brain damage in the Iranian response. But more importantly than that, it was Donald Trump that stood down because he had said that if there were any attacks on any American bases as a result of Iranian retaliation for the murder of Soleimani, that he would send, and I'm quoting him, some of his shiny $2 trillion worth of weapons without hesitation, he said, towards Iran. And he even said they had identified sites, including Iranian cultural sites, a war crime. He's the one who said that that would happen. Well, indisputably, there was an attack on an American base, but there was no American response. And That's partly down to the electoral cycle in the United States. It was a calculation by Donald Trump and his advisors that if the United States ramped up this conflict, Iran would do so too. And a cataclysmic war would very likely have been the result. That's not usually a good look in the run-up to a presidential election. But I think that the United States itself knows that the 21st is not, already not, and definitely not going to be a new American century, which all those decades ago, all the zealots around the neocons in the United States predicted and planned that it would be. There are now many powers emerging, particularly China, but also Russia, which in military terms is proving more than a match for America's will to subjugate other peoples. In Syria, the United States has lost. I believe in Lebanon, the United States has lost. In Libya, the United States has lost. In Yemen, the United States has lost its power in the Middle East. And this will be masked by a strategic veneer that the United States, no longer dependent in any way on Middle East oil, is about to pivot its foreign policy and military preoccupations towards Asia. But the withdrawal of United States forces, which I assure you is imminent in Iraq, anyone who's seen the millions on the streets know what even thousands, maybe hundreds of those crowds could do to the isolated United States presence in Iraq. They will be leaving Iraq. They will stay in the satrapies in the Gulf because these satrapies have no choice but to allow them to do so. But anyone with any ability to drive the United States out of the Middle East is going to do so. And not in 5 years either, much shorter period than that. Think Lebanon, 1982. If they don't leave peacefully by negotiation, they will leave under fire, shot and shell. So my point of view is that the United States is no paper tiger, is still a tiger, but not the biggest tiger in the jungle, despite all of its weaponry. But I'm joined here by an audience of distinguished experts, more so even than usual, but one or two enthusiastic amateurs like me. So let me turn to this gentleman in the front row. Sir, introduce yourself. And
hi, George. My name's Christian. I'm from the Midlands. When the Soviet Union collapsed over 30 years ago now, it left the USA as the sole superpower.
Yep.
So that gave the USA 3 decades where basically it was politically the strongest nation on earth, economically the strongest nation on earth, militarily the strongest nation on earth. And it also, what it did, it tried to make itself morally the strongest nation on earth. Now, behind that mask of so-called morality, the USA set about destabilising countries, invasion, regime change, a whole manner of things. It was so brazen, it ignored international law. It just basically ran roughshod over everything. Now, fast forward to where we are now. The USA may still be politically not as strong, economically rapidly being caught up by China, militarily the Russians are close to the same strength, but it has lost all of its morality and all of its reasons that it used to attack and invade. Now people see it for what it is. When it says are we going to go into Iran or Iraq for democratic reasons, for human rights, nobody believes it anymore. You see, and as that has become more and more obvious to people, its friends and its allies have shrunk. Now, how would the USA fight a major war in the Middle East if it's got nobody there who would really allow its troops on the soil. So therefore, rather than a superpower, the USA now resembles a school bully with a catapult shooting at people. Yeah, I think it's
Interesting metaphor.
I think it's a diminished country.
There's an American sitting next to you, Patrick Henningsen, 21st Century Wire. I'm not holding you responsible for the crimes of your country any more than I hope you're holding me responsible for the crimes of mine. But how do you see this picture?
I think what we've seen in the last 4 weeks is it's been historic. We're looking at definitely a new Middle East. The act of Iran retaliating against the United States, hitting 2 U.S. military facilities. First of all, that hasn't happened since the Second World War, and to have the U.S. not retaliate has never happened in history. So historically, we can draw a line under that. In terms of the facelift of the region, this is probably the most significant potential realignment since when Russia entered the Syrian war in October of 2015. And that really gave a facelift to the geopolitics and the balance of power in the region. So this is equally as significant. The reason is this is what you would call in the military circles a revolution in military affairs, driven by technology, driven by the capabilities. And I think the West has time and time again underestimated Iran's ability to develop in this area of military technology. And they have a capacity now with short and intermediate range missiles, whereby anything within that radius in the Arabian Peninsula all the way to the Mediterranean, even Diego Garcia and the Chagos Islands, that is now within Iran's reach. So what this has done is expose the United States and their supposed secure positions in the region. But more than that, and here's the important part, it's not only exposed the United States militarily, it's exposed the U.S.'s allies as well, because they are hosting all of these U.S. facilities that are dotted around the region. And all of a sudden, we have a completely different map that you're looking at right now, potentially. And I think the game changer was on the evening when everyone expected the United States to retaliate. They didn't. There was statements made by Hezbollah and by some Iranian officials that the U.S. Would be treated with Israel as one entity in this story,
and that any Arab country which allowed the U.S. to use its soil or waters or airspace would be regarded as an enemy state.
Yeah, and that's a game changer. So at that point, Israel, as my colleague here says, backed away. So that changed things tremendously. So it couldn't be an isolated, controlled affair. The U.S. would not be able to choose when it was going to end. And Iran has always said that when they strike back, it would be at a time and place of their choosing. And so now they've set the pace, as Russia set the pace with Syria, so everyone else. So those are history's actors now. History's actors are no longer in Washington. They are many and they're diverse now. And that's a difficult thing, I think, for the...
Washington, they're reality TV stars rather than actors.
Yes, that's right.
Shabir, how do you see this? Is the Iranian retaliation for General Soleimani over? Does Trump now want sincerely to de-escalate? In which case, why did he escalate in the first place? You're a geostrategist of note. Tell us what you think.
Thank you very much, George, for those kind words. I think I'll start with Chairman Mao, as you did. And he quite famously said, one who fights and runs away lives to fight another day. So I think in this sort of strategy that Iran is applying, they're not running away, but they're certainly fighting, quietening down and coming back again as and when, as our colleagues said, is required to their choosing. I think the broader picture is also quite fascinating, not just in the Middle East, how America has really lost power. As you know, in the last few days, a remarkably large gathering has been taking place in Caracas, Venezuela, where 52 nations have got together and they were talking about how to sort of oppose imperialism, how to be on the side of the oppressed nations. So that's again another sort of, if you like, the power that America was wielding. Yes, of course, I know that in Bolivia and Ecuador, the people have lost power and America has been influential, but Cuba is still there. Nicaragua is still there. So it's still, even in the backwaters of USA, they are not able to wield that much power. But certainly what's happening in the Middle East is, as you quite rightly pointed out, there were over 2.5 million people. There were a huge number of Iraqis out in Baghdad saying that no more America. So all that is changing. And what you've got to realize that the gift that Mr. Trump and the regime in Washington has given to Iran over the last 41 years is sanctions, extreme sanctions, and whatever kind of problem they want to throw at Iran, Iran has actually become stronger and stronger.
800 sanctions, by the way.
Yeah.
I'll come back to you. I'd like to hear from you, sir. You're a very distinguished expert in Iraqi-Iranian affairs. How does this all look to you?
من الطبيعي جدا يعني أنا أتفق معك تماما وأتفق مع الزملاء الذين تحدثوا عن ضعف الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية الآن في هذا الوقت بالذات، على الرغم من أن الجمهورية الإسلامية لم ترد بالشكل الكافي على اغتيال الشهيد القائد الحاج قاسم سليماني والشهيد القائد الحاج أبو مهدي المهندس. هي قالت بأن ما فعلته كان صفعة مجرد صفعة. وبغض النظر عن الرد الإيراني، أنا أعتقد أن العراق هو الساحة الرئيسة التي ستواصل فيها الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية العمليات الإيذائية سواء للجمهورية الإسلامية أو لمحور المقاومة بشكل عام وتحديدا في العراق. ولذلك فإن العراق تحديدا هو أيضا الساحة التي ستخرج القوات الأمريكية من العراق تحديدا إن عاجلا أو آجلا. لاحظتم في مظاهرات يوم الجمعة الماضية كانت هذه المظاهرات مليونية وواضحة المعالم، وبغض النظر عن المدن التي شهدتها، صحيح هي مدن شيعية تحديدا إلا بغداد وبعض المدن الأخرى فيها كثافة سكانية من السنة، لكنها كانت مظاهرات تعكس وجهة نظر الشارع العراقي برمته. في البصرة تحديدا، أنا من البصرة، هنالك أكثر من 20% من المواطنين من أهل السنة، وكذلك في الناصرية هنالك نسبة كبيرة من أهل السنة في الناصرية، وطبعا في بغداد هنالك نسبة كبيرة جدا من أهل السنة. كلهم شاركوا في المظاهرات التي طالبت بإخراج القوات الأمريكية. السيد ترامب وقع في مأزق كبير. المأزق الكبير هو خروجه عن قواعد اللعبة داخل العراق تحديدا في مسألة المواجهة بين الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وإيران، لأنه كان لا يفترض أن يقوم بعمل عسكري يستهدف مسؤولين وقادة عسكريين إيرانيين. في المقابل كانت إيران أيضا ملتزمة بهذه القواعد ولم تتعرض للقوات الأمريكية. يعني ترامب يكذب عندما يقول أن القائد قاسم سليماني قتل أمريكيين، بالعكس تماما. سليماني كان رجلا مرنا بالإضافة إلى كونه كان قائدا عسكريا، وقد ساعد القوات الأمريكية في الانسحاب الآمن عام 2011 من العراق. الآن لا يوجد قاسم سليماني، إذا من الذي سيضمن للقوات الأمريكية أن تنسحب انسحابا آمنا كما حصل في 2011؟ هذا إذا لم يصر السيد ترامب على رفض الرسالة التي وجهها لها الشارع العراقي بضرورة الانسحاب، وأراد أن يبقي قواته، وعند ذلك ستتحول هذه القوات إلى قوات محتلة وسيتم التعامل معها وفق قواعد المقاومة في أي دولة في العالم. هنالك أيضا غطاء شرعي كبير من المرجع الأعلى السيد علي السيستاني الذي قال بعيد دقائق من انطلاق مظاهرات الجمعة المطالبة بإخراج القوات الأمريكية، قال بأنه يدعم أي وسيلة يستخدمها الشعب العراقي لفرض سيادته ولرفض انتهاك السيادة من قبل الغرباء، ويعني هو تحديدا الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية.
Said Mohsen, how do you see this picture? Is the United States a busted flush? Has Iran effectively defanged the tiger? How does it look to you?
I think they've caught the tail and they've swung it a little bit. And as Ayatollah Khamenei said, we've only slapped them yet. So they've received a slap. And I think that's a very gentle warning that they've been given, because he's doing that on the basis of real absolute confidence on the ground. The real success militarily of the Islamic Republic of Iran in that region, I think, is twofold. One is the ballistic missiles, which is a game changer. That's what the Israelis and the Americans have stopped the JCPOA Iranian nuclear agreement, a perfectly good agreement, because they want to add this clause to get rid of all Iranian ballistic missiles, because they are absolutely terrified of the fact that Tel Aviv, Haifa, etc. can be hit, and that Iran is not
and Riyadh and Dubai and
yeah, the whole region. So this is, I think, the first string to Iranian success in terms of military. The other string they have is asymmetric warfare. What they've done is perfected on the ground a real mobilization of hearts and minds amongst ordinary resistance-orientated anti-oppression forces. That's Christians, it's Muslims of Sunni Shia. It's not just a Shia, if you like, anti-oppression movement. It's a global one that's linked in. The example of that is I was in Iran for about 4 months last year, towards the end of last year. And I saw, I witnessed many of these people, the individual soldiers, the people on the ground who are going to face any forced American, if you like, stay in the region beyond this year. And believe you me, what you're facing there is not just a set of people absolutely excellently equipped, tactically very aware, militarily hardened in the battlefields of Syria and beyond. You're also facing people who are totally and absolutely committed to a moral, spiritual justice. This emanates from Ayatollah Khomeini, and people don't want to necessarily always pay attention to this. But there's a real moral conviction for the oppressed that these people have, and they will give their lives. They absolutely don't care about dying on the battlefields for this cause. They're dying for their children who are being economically terrorized. They're going to die for their mothers who are widowed. They're going to die for their fathers who have been humiliated by America generation after generation. They have a cause. The American military doesn't have a cause. It has a mercenary intent based on transnational corporate interests and the American industrial military machine. There's a very big difference on the ground if you're going to fight a war, and the Vietnam War is probably the one that you ought to look at as the parallel, perhaps, to this. Terrain may be different. Hearts and minds are not. And I think the Americans and their policymakers and those neoconservatives which are urging some sort of feasible contest in the Middle East should think again, because it really will not end well for any of the occupation forces. In Iraq, we have an American occupation force. Iran has prevented that occupation force from coming to its borders, yes, by fighting asymmetrically across Yemen, yes, by defending people beyond its borders, because it knew if it didn't, the Americans were already in their backyards with regime change and green, revolutions, and they've stopped it at their doorsteps. Perfectly legitimate.
much more of this to come after the break. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming from London, discussing the standoff, the conflict between the US and Iran. Earlier, we took the Kalima Horra camera onto the streets of London to see what the people thought. Let's take a look.
Is Iran's direct attack on US bases in Iraq breaking the perception of US military dominance in the region?
No, I don't think so.
Well, I don't think it does necessarily break the dominance of the region, because the US still is going to have tons of bases around Iran anyways. What it shows is that Iran wanted to give at least an act of retaliation against an act that they didn't agree with and they thought needed to have a response to.
I believe that it was a very strong step towards saying to Iran, like, we are powerful, we're trying to show our cards and whatnot. And they didn't really expect any retaliation from them. However, what happened, and then the normal retaliation from Iran, I believe, made the U.S. kind of step back and say, whoa, are we really going to start a war with this country? Maybe they kind of underestimated Iran's influence around the world, because if they were to assess the situation for an possible all-out war between the two, Iran is one of the strongest forces in the world.
Do you think the US might withdraw from Iraq sooner now, and what might happen if they don't?
It's Trump we're talking about, so they haven't done it in 15 years, even though they said they would have. When Barack Obama took some of the units back, they still had quite a good grasp in Iraq still. And now, with Iran showing a little bit of strength or will to retaliate against some actions or misactions, I feel just justifies them even more now not to leave the country again.
I don't think America want that, to be honest. I don't think they will. And with President Trump, he's more of a more standoffish president. He'll definitely want confrontation when he can. However, because of a lot of backlash, I think he'll back off.
Trump said he would remove the troops from Iraq, but I think they send more soldiers, from my understanding, and I don't think the conflict is anywhere close to being resolved. From how it's shaping in the region, especially with Turkey, the problems in Syria, I don't think America will ever leave Iraq.
They already have bases in Qatar. The biggest base that they have is in Qatar, so they don't really lack any bases in the area. But Iraq is the most strategic place for them in terms of Iran. The situation has not been solved with Iran, so retracting their bases would kind of make them way weaker than they are now. So I don't think they would retract them anywhere soon.
Jonathan Pryor, a journalist, broadcaster, a prominent Liberal Democrat political figure. How does it all look from your perspective?
Well, I think one of the most interesting things recently that's happened is not just that several of the Arab states in the Gulf region have to a certain extent distanced themselves from Washington's plans, but also we've been seeing much more mutation of the attitude of the European countries. Certainly the EU, particularly France and Germany and even Britain for most of the time, been pressing very hard to keep the joint JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, alive and trying to restrain Trump. And that's really very interesting because, of course, Donald Trump and the Americans in general like to consider themselves to be the leaders of the West, and what America thinks, what Washington thinks, then Europe will follow. And that's not happened recently in many of the issues concerned. Bit more ambiguous, of course, about Boris Johnson, because he came up with this rather bizarre suggestion that there could be a new nuclear deal, which he would call the Trump deal, which might flatter the president's vanity, but is hardly likely to be welcomed in Tehran. But I think we are seeing a real sea change. And just as you said in the beginning of the program, this is not going to be another American century in the way that, frankly, much of the 20th century was. We are in a multipolar world, and Iran is right to champion its own position in that multipolar world as an important regional power.
The US has lost its soft power, hasn't it? You're much younger than me, but nonetheless, we both grew up in an era where the US had considerable soft power. Everyone wanted to be an American, the movies, the TV, the music, and so on. It's not like that now, is it?
I think that's right. I mean, if one thinks even about Hollywood and the movies, they no longer have the domination that was.
And even the Hollywood movies, 2 out of every $3 are Chinese.
Absolutely. And we're seeing people, accepting that we live in a much more multicultural world, much more diverse world. They don't just want American products. They don't just want Coca-Cola and McDonald's. They want to try all sorts of other things and recognize that maybe it's unhealthy to have a situation as we've had over the last half century or more where America has been so dominant. We've gained some things. Not everything about America is bad, of course not. And there are many wonderful people in the United States. But we are in a world now, particularly here in a place like London where this program's been recorded. We live in a multicultural city with people of all different traditions, and we've learned to live with those different traditions in a way that perhaps the United States still hasn't quite come to terms with.
Quite so. Let's take the lady in the middle. You're wearing a cowboy hat, madam. I don't know if you are an American, but you're welcome in any case.
I'm not. It's an Argentinian hat.
Please forgive me.
The United States don't have that blackmail power that they used to have before on the governments now, because the people are having their eye on their governments and the corruption. So news are not belonging to Rupert Murdoch anymore. They come from everywhere.
Good point.
You have journalists going everywhere, independently, bringing news, bringing images, and clearing a little bit this confusion. Iraq was confused for decades, thinking that the Shia did it in this market, the Sunni did it in this mosque, and vice versa, making people around the world thinking that there is a conflict between Shia and Sunni, which doesn't exist. They're married, they're intermarried, they live together, everything is peaceful between them. And now there's a new trend launched by Bashar al-Assad, who's a very intelligent person, which is the popular resistance, but in a vast dimension and very well organized. And when you have popular resistance and when you have people agreeing together, being one hand, no army can defeat them. And no plot can work for the long term with them. So now the enemy of the Zionist octopus, who controls the United States government and who doesn't represent the American good-hearted people and funny, nice and innocent and naive.
You think the Americans are innocent and naive?
The people.
Well,
yes,
that's a new one.
The people are innocent and naive, and they don't know about all the plots of the government. So they would believe what is said on TV and gobble the propaganda, the lies. Now we are seeing the lies. So
you're optimistic, I can tell.
No shame in lying now. The truth is obvious, but the lies are told anyway.
Well, Trump does have, in this regard and some others, a unique capacity to literally state an untruth after an untruth after an untruth, whilst knowing...
To lie consistently.
Yeah, to lie consistently, whilst knowing that people know that it's a lie. I gave one at the beginning of the show. He lied with the whole world watching that no American had been injured in the Iranian retaliation, when, as you now look back on it, it's quite clear from his lateness in appearing on the platform and his shortness of breath and his palpitations almost, knowing that actually that was very far from true.
He didn't tweet for a whole day.
A whole day, imagine. Let me take this gentleman in the middle row. I think you have a different point of view, sir. You're going to express it in Arabic. I hope someone will help us understand. Go ahead.
شكرا جزيلا. أنا أعتقد المشكلة الأساسية إنه إيران مساعدتها لحماس ومساعدتها لحزب الله هذا سبب رئيسي لاعتداء أمريكا عليها. ولو كانت إيران تتفق مع إسرائيل لكانت إيران تصبح الآن دولة جيدة، وممكن حتى أن يعطى لها أن تحاول أن تكون كنترول للدول الخليج. Thank you very much.
So that Iran would make a deal with it.
Imagine about this thing. Never, I know that. But imagine if Iran make a deal.
Well, of course, you know, again, I'm old enough to remember when Iran was the West's best friend in the region. As a matter of fact, we were desperately imploring the Shah to buy nuclear reactors. I've seen the advertisements
everything.
At the time. So they're not against Iran because they're Iranian or because they're Shiite. The Shah was Shiite. They're against the Iranian state for political reasons. Thank you very much. This gentleman down here.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that it would be disastrous because my background is, although I'm born and bred here, my background is Pakistani. Now, our leader has gone to Saudi Arabia, Iran. You might know of Imran Khan, Prime Minister of Pakistan. He's gone to Iran, he's gone to Saudi Arabia, and he said to Trump that I don't believe in war. Pakistan will never side with anyone. We've done your war on terror. It's cost thousands of lives. In fact, they went to Guantanamo Bay. And, I mean, all these things about going into war in Afghanistan, it's cost a lot for Pakistan. So he said that it's just disastrous and it would be economically a negative impact on Pakistan because Iran is next door to Pakistan. Saudi Arabia has been a friend, close ally to Pakistan since whenever. And even though Trump admires Imran Khan, but Imran Khan said that the only way you can move forward is just peace and not through war. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure that'll necessarily persuade Donald Trump, or rather, Patrick, those around Donald Trump. I may be alone in this room in believing that Trump does not actually want a war with Iran, but there are plenty of people in his circle that genuinely do want a war. In fact, some of them have almost made a career out of the demand for regime change. Giuliani, for example, is on the payroll of the so-called MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq. John Bolton, of course, he's no longer in the inner circle, but was until very recently. His whole life is dedicated to regime change in Iran. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, the Donald Trump circle, unfortunately, this is one of the byproducts of him coming in baptized by fire in inauguration and the Senate confirmation hearings and tearing apart anybody that would step up to serve in his cabinet, is that he was left with very little to choose from. And so, of course, on the door knocking were the Project for a New American Century gaggle of neoconservatives, and that did suit Donald Trump's kind of, he likes to tout his military, love for the military.
Quite ironic, really,
right.
Considering his bone spurs precluded any military service.
He went to a military academy when he was young, and I think he's trying to make good on his bone spurs of the past. But so that is a problem. But more than that, I think more than any other White House administration, this presidency is so close to Israel and maybe the Likudite faction of Israel than any other president in history. His son-in-law is long-term family friends with the Netanyahus, of course. So, and what we've seen in Jerusalem with the embassy being moved, the annexation of the West Bank, giving a blessing to the annexation of the Golan Heights, more than any other presidency, Israel is driving U.S. Middle East policy. It has implored Trump within the...
What's in that for Trump? You see, this puzzles me because hardly any Jewish people voted for Donald Trump. Jewish people in America overwhelmingly vote for the Democrats. Bernie Sanders might well be the Democratic Party candidate in the next election. Trump doesn't need money, and Netanyahu is a wounded animal, really. He's indicted, he faces jail. The only way he can stay out of jail is to stay in the Prime Minister's house. What's in that for Trump? Why is he such an obedient servant to the Likud line?
Donald Trump needs votes as well, and he did carry the evangelical vote. So the Christian Zionist element is key in carrying the Bible Belt and some of the heartland areas in America. So it's a short-term, possibly a short-term strategic calculus that every Republican or conservative president makes to pander to certain factions and demographics in order to get that edge. And it's going to be a tight presidential race, even the next one, as tight as the last one probably. We're very close, so all of these things do matter. But what does it mean in terms of U.S. power? Is this in the U.S.'s long-term interest to confront Iran or to back up Israel, who wants to confront Iran? So we're caught in a really very tricky situation in history where you do have these different religious forces. And trust me that the Christian Zionist lobby in America, they very much believe in their eschatological end times narratives, as do many other Christians and Muslim sects around the world. This very strongly guides their destiny, as it were. And so you can't ignore these things. There are competing eschatological narratives at play, and I do think we're seeing some of these playing out right now in the Middle East. And politicians will use these. Politicians in Israel, politicians in the Gulf, politicians in Washington will use these as well, cynically in some cases, genuinely true believers in other cases. So it's a very complicated cocktail. Politics, faith, and electoral strategies in Washington.
Well, thank God, Jonathan, we don't have such a cocktail here, though we have our own cocktails. Faith is not really a feature in our politics. But I want to press you on the Boris Johnson thing. You see, what Boris Johnson said was the deal, if the deal is dead, and you're right to say he's not trying as hard as the French and the Germans are to save it, then we have to have a Trump deal. That's not by definition a bad idea, is it? It would depend what the Trump deal was. Do you think Boris Johnson is playing any constructive role? You think he's trying to play Greece to Donald Trump's Rome?
Well, I think certainly he's trying to use the influence that he has with the White House, which he does, they're great chums, to try to rein in Trump. That's a difficult task. Would the deal be any better? That I rather doubt, I have to say. I mean, Trump has made it very clear that if there is going to be a new deal, whatever it's called, it would mean more conditions on Iran, Iran having more tight restrictions on it. And then, of course, the decision would be for Tehran to decide, is it prepared to give any more on what it's given already, unless it got the sanctions lifted. And this is a really important issue because Iran is suffering. It has had these hideous sanctions against it for years now, which have really hit ordinary people in their ordinary lives. High inflation, high costs of food and so on, restrictions on some medicines. And I think we would only see a new deal happening if A, it doesn't demand too much from Iran, and B, the sanctions are lifted, and then it would be palatable to Tehran, and the Europeans would go along with it as well.
Said, you were there, you say, for 4 months. There is opposition to the government in Iran. I don't think it can be characterized as mass opposition. There are 75 million people in Iran. Let's say 15 million people hate the system, hate the political leadership, but they are quite strategically concentrated. They're in Tehran, most of them, many of them. They speak English, and journalists always seem to find them. Even the British ambassador found them at what he thought was a vigil, he said. How much internal conflict is there in Iran, and how might that impact on the outcome?
I think the first thing to understand that is that Iran is a complicated form of democracy. Yes, it has an overarching supreme leader and it has a system called Vilayat-e-Faqih, which is unique in terms of regulating certain parameters. Those parameters are not really that much different from secular democracy. There are parameters.
They're effectively the Constitution.
Yes, I mean, but they
Just
allow.
like we have one.
Yes.
Or we don't actually, but the Americans have got one.
Yeah, but within that, as with our system, there's an allowance for people to debate, discuss, and there are very conflicting political positions. In fact, the current government, many would argue, is not really absolutely in keeping with...
This is President Rouhani.
Yeah, it's not necessarily absolutely in keeping
my most
with...
distinguished former constituent.
Indeed, and it's argued that that's a healthy thing to have that sort of, if you like, difference. The problem comes when external foreign nations start injecting funds and finances and hiring mercenaries, hiring troublemakers to create violence. So as with recent protests, you saw that perfectly legitimate grievances about the rise in prices of oil and gas or whatever that went up because of the sanctions. They'd been stalling them for many years. Those were jumped upon very quickly. Once you had the people out protesting, as they do with the Yellow Jackets in France. The reality on the ground is ordinary people are just like you and I. They want their shelter, they want their food, and they want their clothes. Many of them haven't necessarily fully understood the spiritual, epoch and the ethos of Ayatollah Khomeini necessarily right now. But those people do hold some grudges because they basically want the kind of hyper-capitalist system which exists in the West. So they want to get richer. They're the ones primarily who drive the agitation, collaborate with outsiders, and cause, I would say, the upset. That's basically regime change material for those here. But I would say at the core, there is a now, because of the sanctions, a return to the original ethos of the revolution. So, for instance, re-examining the economy. Now, Iran now is agriculturally far more sustainable. It can produce its own food. It's got its own internal industries because it can't import expensive pharmaceuticals, etc. It's built its own military, if you like, technological capability. It's got a scientific and university education advancement beyond many in its region. I think that there's obviously a lot of propaganda that you've got to get beyond. That doesn't surface paper over the fact that there are still major challenges for Iran to overcome. It's a case of really being realistic. At the moment, though, you saw what happened after General Soleimani. The hearts and minds of those people are united as Iranians. Over 6 or 7 million people turned out just in Tehran. In Iraq, there's been millions. So you can see that the lies and the propaganda, and in fact, the BBC said very little. They actually said nothing up to midday on their sites about what was going on in Iraq. They underplayed what happened in Iran. So that tells you that here in the West, we're fed a lot of fake news. We're being engineered towards hating Iran, to hating the other, and to fearing them. That plays into us here, and this is my final point here. There's a blowback. Straight after General Soleimani's, if you like, fake news and propaganda exercise, straight away the Islamic Centre of England here in Britain was targeted by the Times newspaper, by the Telegraph and others. They started to put them in the same category as the Takfiri ISIS fraternity, which are, as far as we're concerned, false flag, Western deep state operations. But they're now using that to link, if you like, Islamic revolutionary or Iranian politics with Muslims living here again. So we've got a double whammy with this now. We're now being told, along with the climate extinction people and the Greenpeace folk and the folk who are fighting for ordinary justice in this country, the campaign against arms trade, we're all being told that we're all extremists if we say the kind of narratives that you and I are perhaps rolling out. I believe that's a real threat to our civil liberties and our democracy here. So what's happening in Iran seriously is being used also here in the West to undermine our democracy, our civil liberties. So it's not a distant war by any means. If the Hormuz gets mined by the Iranians, if the Americans start a war there, that's going to shut down 20 to 30% of economic business in the world. It's meltdown. If nuclear weapons are used by Israel in the region, that fallout is going to affect all of us. So I would suggest the whole world stand up, take note, and actually rein in these psychopaths, whether they're Israeli Benjamin Netanyahu or it's Donald Trump. We need, as a collective, as people, to rise up and properly tell these people enough is enough. Stop.
Shabir, this MEK organization that I refer to, some might find it too obscure to fasten on this point, but they are based in Albania, in Europe. They have a gigantic budget now paid by Saudi Arabia, probably, on behalf of the United States. Are they any kind of real threat to the Islamic Republic, do you think?
Well, for the last 41 years, they've been trying all kinds of antics. You may remember vividly.
They were in Iraq under the patronage of Saddam.
At that time. But I'm saying even before, soon after the revolution, they started planting bombs in mosques. They killed off 72 parliamentarians in the early part of the revolutions. They targeted prominent academics, journalists, and religious scholars. So their terrorism has been, it's a litany of harm and mayhem that they have tried to create in Iran. So Iran has stood against the MKO, I think Mujahideen Khalq organization. But obviously, since the demise of the founder, Mr. Rajavi, his wife, Mariam, has taken over. And she, some people say that if women come into politics or head organizations, they might bring a softer element to politics. But I think,
those people never lived under Margaret Thatcher.
Absolutely. That's what I was thinking of. So Mariam, being a woman, is, perhaps as vicious as any man can ever be in trying to sort of topple the government in Tehran. But I think the greatest gift that has happened after Martyr Soleimani's assassination is that globally, this sort of what the sister was talking about earlier, that Shia Sunni narrative, which was being presented for the last umpteens of years, I think has been exposed, because I think you have quite rightly on many occasions, George, pointed out that the Palestinians, 98% are Sunni, but Iran continues to support that. So at the end of the day, it's not a Shia Sunni thing. And I'll coin a phrase for you today. It's the sushi movement that is taking place in the Middle East now. Shia and Sunni together.
I hope you're right. It's been marvelous for me. I hope it was for you. Thanks for watching.